I was camping in the remote woods of Arizona, far away from any civilization. It was a clear night, and the stars were shining brightly. I was sitting by the campfire, roasting marshmallows, when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I dismissed it as a small animal and continued enjoying my evening. But the rustling persisted, and it grew louder and closer. I started to feel uneasy and looked around, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the forest, and I froze in terror. I knew then that something was very wrong. I slowly stood up and grabbed my flashlight. I scanned the area around me and caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as it moved closer, I realized it was something far more terrifying. It was a skinwalker, a shape-shifting creature from Native American legend. It was tall and thin, with matted fur and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, and its hands were tipped with sharp claws. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The skinwalker moved closer and let out a blood-curdling scream. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, and I knew that my life was in danger. But then, as if by some miracle, the skinwalker suddenly turned and darted away into the forest. I stood there, trembling, for what felt like hours before I finally mustered the courage to move again. I packed up my campsite as quickly as I could and hiked out of the woods as fast as my legs would carry me. I never looked back, afraid that the skinwalker might return. I will never forget that terrifying encounter in the woods, and I will always wonder why the skinwalker spared my life. But one thing is for certain, I will never go camping alone in the wilderness again. I was hiking through the dense woods near my hometown when I saw something that I'll never forget. At first, I thought it was just a large animal, but as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It had the body of a wolf, but its eyes were human. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks. As it got closer, I could see that it was limping, like it had been injured. I tried to back away slowly, but it started growling and snarling at me. That's when I knew that it wasn't just an ordinary animal. It was a skinwalker. I'd heard stories about skinwalkers before, but I never thought I'd actually see one. They're shapeshifters, able to take on the form of any animal they choose. But they're also dangerous, known to attack humans and steal their identities. I started to panic as it got closer, and I knew I had to do something. I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was a kid. He said that if you ever encounter a skinwalker, you have to speak its name. That's the only way to break its power and send it back to the spirit world. I took a deep breath and shouted, "I know who you are. You can't fool me. Your name is not mine to speak, and you have no power over me." To my surprise, the skinwalker stopped in its tracks. It looked confused for a moment, as if it didn't know what to do. Then, it started to back away slowly, disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't believe what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to encounter a skinwalker again. I grew up on a reservation, and I've heard stories of skinwalkers my entire life. My parents and grandparents always warned me to never speak of them, lest they come and find me. But as a child, I never truly believed in them. That all changed one summer when I was 16. I was camping with my friends in the mountains, miles away from any town or city. We set up our tents near a river, and spent the day hiking and swimming. As night fell, we built a fire and sat around it, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. As the fire died down and my friends began to doze off, I stayed awake, staring into the darkness beyond the reach of our campfire. That's when I heard it. A sound like a coyote, but off somehow. It was deeper, more guttural. I shook it off as my imagination and tried to go to sleep. But then, I heard it again. And again. Each time, it sounded closer. I woke up my friends, but they just groggily told me to go back to sleep. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the direction of the river. I woke up my friends again, and this time they heard it too. We all sat up, staring into the darkness, when suddenly we saw movement. A figure emerged from the trees, walking towards our campsite. It was humanoid, but its body was twisted and contorted in a way that made it clear it was not human. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and I could see that its skin was covered in dark fur. I knew in that moment that it was a skinwalker. I tried to get my friends to run, but they were frozen in fear. The skinwalker was getting closer, and I knew that we were in danger. I remembered my grandfather's stories about how to fend off a skinwalker. I grabbed some salt from our food supplies and threw it at the creature, chanting a prayer my grandfather had taught me. The skinwalker recoiled and let out a blood-curdling scream. It ran back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. We packed up our things and left the campsite that night, driving all the way back to town. I never told anyone about what happened, but I never forgot it either. I know now that skinwalkers are real, and they are not to be trifled with. I was on a solo camping trip deep in the woods of Arizona. I had always been drawn to the wilderness and the peace it offered, but this trip would be different. This time, I would encounter something that would shake me to my core. It was my third day in the woods, and I had found the perfect spot to set up camp. I had a clear view of the starry sky and could hear the soothing sounds of the nearby creek. As I settled into my tent for the night, I heard something that made me freeze in terror. It was the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I tried to brush it off as a small animal or the wind, but the sound persisted. It was too loud to be just a breeze. That's when I heard a faint whisper outside my tent, and my heart raced with fear. I tried to calm myself down, thinking that it could be a fellow camper lost in the woods or someone just trying to spook me. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling my tent. I knew I had to act fast. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered out. That's when I saw a figure standing a few feet away from me, staring straight at me. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its eyes were piercing and glowing in the dark, and its face was twisted into a sinister grin. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. That's when I realized what it was: a skinwalker. I had heard stories about these creatures before, but I never believed in them until that moment. The skinwalker took a step closer, and I could feel its hot breath on my face. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. But then, everything went silent. I opened my eyes to find the creature gone, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. I packed up my camp as quickly as possible and left the woods without looking back. It was an experience I would never forget and one that I would never want to relive again. From that moment on, I knew that the wilderness was not always a peaceful escape, and that some things were better left unseen and unheard. I'm not sure what made me decide to go camping alone in the remote woods of northern Canada, but I did it anyway. I had always been drawn to nature, and the idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife was appealing to me. I had plenty of experience camping, so I wasn't too worried about being alone. But that was before I encountered the Wendigo. I had been camping for a few days when I noticed something strange happening around me. The wildlife had disappeared. No birds chirping, no rustling in the bushes. It was eerily quiet. And then I heard it, a low growling sound, like something was watching me from the shadows. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep, but I was restless. I kept hearing the growling sound, and it was getting closer. I felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The next day, I decided to hike around the area and see if I could find any clues as to what was happening. That's when I saw it, a tall, emaciated figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Its eyes glowed yellow in the sunlight, and its skin was stretched tightly over its bones. I knew immediately what it was, a Wendigo. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The Wendigo just stared at me, watching me with its piercing gaze. I slowly backed away, trying not to make any sudden movements. But the Wendigo started to follow me, its footsteps silent on the forest floor. I ran back to my campsite, grabbing my things and trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. But the Wendigo was right behind me, its claws scraping against the trees as it chased me through the woods. I don't know how I managed to make it out alive. But somehow, I did. I never went camping alone again after that. The memory of that Wendigo still haunts me to this day. I can still hear its growling, feel its cold breath on my neck. And I know that I'm lucky to have survived that encounter. I grew up in a small town surrounded by dense forests. My friends and I would often go camping and hiking in the woods during the summer months. We had heard stories about skinwalkers and other strange creatures, but we never really believed in them. That is, until one summer when we had a terrifying encounter. It was a warm and humid evening, and my friends and I decided to camp in a clearing we had never been to before. We set up our tents and started a fire. We were roasting marshmallows and telling scary stories when we heard a strange noise. It was a low growl that seemed to be coming from the woods. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but the growling got louder and more aggressive. We decided to investigate and grabbed our flashlights. As we walked towards the woods, we saw a figure in the distance. It was hunched over and walking on all fours. We couldn't make out what it was, but we knew it wasn't any animal we had seen before. The figure disappeared into the woods, and we decided to follow it. We walked deeper and deeper into the forest, and the growling got louder and louder. We started to feel uneasy and decided to turn back, but that's when we saw it. Standing in front of us was a creature unlike anything we had ever seen. It was a human-like figure, but its skin was gray and leathery. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and it had sharp claws instead of hands. We knew immediately that it was a skinwalker. We froze in terror as the creature started to walk towards us. It let out a bone-chilling scream that made our skin crawl. We tried to run, but it was too fast. It chased us through the woods, and we could hear its growling getting closer and closer. Just when we thought it was the end, we saw a group of people in the distance. They were wearing traditional Navajo clothing and carrying weapons. The skinwalker stopped chasing us and turned to face the group. They started to chant, and the creature disappeared into thin air. We later found out that the Navajo tribe had been hunting the skinwalker for years. They told us that the creature was once a medicine man who had turned to dark magic. He had been cursed to become a skinwalker and was now a danger to everyone around him. Since that night, I have never gone camping in the woods again. I still get chills thinking about the skinwalker and how close we were to danger. It's a memory that will stay with me forever. I used to love taking long walks in the woods behind my house. It was a peaceful escape from the stresses of everyday life. But that all changed one fateful evening. I had been walking for about an hour when I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. At first, I thought it was just a small animal, but the rustling grew louder and more persistent. Suddenly, the bushes parted, and I caught a glimpse of something moving quickly through the underbrush. My heart raced as I quickened my pace. I knew I needed to get out of the woods as quickly as possible, but the rustling grew louder, and I could hear heavy breathing behind me. It was almost as if something was chasing me. I picked up my pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of my own heavy breathing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees ahead of me. It was tall, with matted fur and glowing eyes. I froze in terror as it began to walk toward me. As it drew closer, I could see that its face was twisted and deformed, almost inhuman. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature was upon me in seconds, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. I was certain I was going to die. But then, the creature spoke. It was a voice I recognized, a voice from my past. It was my ex-boyfriend, who I had broken up with months ago. I couldn't believe it. How had he turned into this monstrous creature? He explained that he had become a skinwalker, a shapeshifter, after studying under a Native American medicine man. He had become obsessed with gaining supernatural powers, and had made a deal with the devil to become a skinwalker. I was terrified, but something inside me told me to stay calm. I remembered reading that skinwalkers are afraid of being exposed, and that they can only maintain their powers if they remain hidden. So, I stood my ground and refused to be afraid. I told him that I would expose him to the world if he didn't leave me alone. The creature seemed to hesitate for a moment, then it let out a piercing howl and vanished into the woods. I made it home safely that night, but I never went back into the woods again. And I still get chills thinking about what could have happened if I had given into my fear. I used to live in a small town in the southwestern United States. My family had a ranch on the outskirts of town, and I loved spending time there, especially during the summer months. The ranch was nestled in a picturesque valley, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. It was a beautiful place to be, but it could also be dangerous. The locals often talked about skinwalkers, malevolent beings that could take on the form of animals and people. One summer evening, I was out exploring the ranch with my little brother. We were chasing each other through the woods, laughing and shouting, when we heard a strange noise. It sounded like a mix between a growl and a scream, and it was coming from somewhere ahead of us. We both froze in terror, and my heart began to race. I knew what the noise was. It was a skinwalker. My parents had warned me about them, and I had read all the stories, but I had never actually seen one before. We slowly backed away, trying not to make any noise. But then we heard the noise again, closer this time. It was like the skinwalker was toying with us, luring us in. My brother started to cry, and I knew I had to do something to protect him. I picked him up and started to run back towards the ranch. But the skinwalker was fast, and it was gaining on us. We burst out of the woods and into the open field, and I could see the lights of the ranch in the distance. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the skinwalker's breath on my neck, and I knew we were almost out of time. But then we made it to the ranch, and I slammed the door shut behind us. I locked it as quickly as I could, and then I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My parents came running when they heard the commotion, and they could see the fear in our eyes. They knew what had happened, and they comforted us as best they could. That was the first and only time I ever saw a skinwalker, but the memory of that night has stayed with me ever since. I know that there are some things in this world that we can't explain, and that we can't always protect ourselves from. But I also know that we are stronger when we stick together, and that love and family can get us through even the darkest of nights. I never believed in skinwalkers. Growing up in the Southwest, I always thought they were just stories that people told to scare each other. But that all changed one night when I was camping with some friends in the desert. We had set up our tents near an old abandoned mine. We had heard stories about the mine being haunted, but we didn't pay much attention to them. We were just there to have a good time, drink some beers, and enjoy the stars. It was getting late, and we were all sitting around the campfire, telling stories and laughing. That's when we heard it. A strange howling sound, coming from the direction of the mine. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. We all went quiet, listening to the eerie sound. Then, it stopped. We all shrugged it off and went back to our conversation. But then, we heard it again. This time, it was closer. We all got up, shining our flashlights towards the mine. That's when we saw it. A figure, standing at the entrance of the mine. It was tall, with long arms and legs. But the most terrifying part was its eyes. They were glowing red, like two hot coals in the darkness. We all froze, not knowing what to do. That's when the figure started moving towards us. It was walking on two legs, but it moved with an unnatural speed. We could hear the sound of its feet hitting the ground, like it was running on all fours. We all started running, back to our tents. I could hear the figure getting closer, its breathing heavy and labored. We made it to our tents, zipping them closed behind us. We could hear the figure outside, scratching at the fabric of the tents. We stayed up all night, huddled together, listening to the strange noises outside. Eventually, the noises stopped, and we fell asleep. The next morning, we packed up our things and left the campsite. We didn't talk much about what happened that night. But we all knew that we had encountered something terrifying, something that we couldn't explain. Now, whenever I'm camping in the desert, I always keep an eye out for the figure. I never want to encounter it again. I'm not sure how to start this, but I know that I need to share what happened to me. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I know what I saw was real. I was camping in the remote woods of Arizona with some friends. We had been planning this trip for months, and we were excited to get away from civilization for a while. The first couple of days were great. We hiked, fished, and explored the area around us. But on the third night, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling outside of our tent. I tried to wake up my friends, but they were sound asleep. I figured it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. It was a voice, but not one I recognized. It sounded like a mix of a human and an animal, and it was whispering my name. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I wanted to wake up my friends again, but I was too scared to move. Then, I heard footsteps around our tent, and I could tell that whatever was out there was circling us. I heard branches snapping and leaves crunching, and then I heard the voice again. It was louder this time, and it was calling my name more urgently. I don't know what came over me, but I found the courage to peek out of the tent. What I saw still haunts me to this day. It was a figure, but it wasn't human. It had the body of a man, but the head of a deer. Its eyes were glowing, and it had antlers that reached towards the sky. I knew right away that I was looking at a skinwalker. I froze, and the skinwalker stared back at me. We locked eyes for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then, it turned and ran off into the woods. The rest of the night, I stayed awake, watching the woods and listening for any sounds. I didn't sleep at all, and when the sun finally rose, I woke up my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me at first, but they could tell that I was shaken. We packed up and left the campsite that day, and I haven't been camping since. I don't know what that skinwalker wanted, but I know that it was after me. I still have nightmares about that night, and I hope that I never have to experience something like that again. I never believed in supernatural creatures until I had a terrifying encounter with a Wendigo. It was a cold winter night, and I was driving back home after a long day at work. The roads were covered in snow, and the wind was howling, making it hard to see ahead. As I was driving through the forest, I saw a figure moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a deer or a bear, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and razor-sharp claws. Its eyes were glowing red, and its skin was gray and mottled. I could smell its stench from my car, a putrid mix of rotting flesh and damp earth. I froze in fear as the creature started walking towards me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by something else. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The Wendigo came closer, its mouth agape, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. I thought I was going to die right then and there. But then, as suddenly as it appeared, the Wendigo turned and ran back into the forest. I sat there, trembling and in shock, wondering if it was all just a nightmare. The next day, I went back to the spot where I saw the creature, and I found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. But I know what I saw, and it still haunts me to this day. I never drive through that forest at night again. And if you ever find yourself on those roads, be careful. You never know what kind of creature might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to prey on unsuspecting travelers. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I had a close encounter with a Wendigo a few years ago. I was on a solo camping trip in the deep woods of northern Canada. It was the middle of winter, and the snow was deep and soft. I had everything I needed with me, a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, and plenty of food and water. On the third night of my trip, I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low growling sound that seemed to be coming from all around me. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noise only grew louder and more persistent. I unzipped my tent and peered outside, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Suddenly, something brushed past my leg, and I jumped back in fright. I shone my flashlight around, and that's when I saw it, a tall, gaunt figure standing just beyond the reach of my light. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it stepped into the light, I saw that it was something else entirely. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed with a hungry, feral light. It had long, sharp claws and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. I knew then that I was face to face with a Wendigo. I scrambled back into my tent and tried to zip it up, but the creature was too quick. It leapt onto the fabric and began to tear at it with its claws. I could hear its growls and snarls getting louder, and I knew I was in serious trouble. Just as I thought all was lost, I remembered the silver knife I had brought with me as a last resort. I grabbed it and lunged at the Wendigo with all my strength, hoping to catch it off guard. To my surprise, the knife found its mark, and the creature let out an unearthly shriek. It backed away, bleeding from the wound, and disappeared into the darkness. I packed up my campsite as quickly as I could and made my way back to civilization. When I told people what had happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. But I know what I saw that night, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. So if you're ever in the deep woods of northern Canada, be careful. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. I've always been a fan of camping, So when my friend asked me to join him on a weekend trip, I jumped at the opportunity. We chose a remote spot in the forest where we could hike and fish to our heart's content. Little did we know, we would have a close encounter with the supernatural. On the second night of our trip, we were sitting by the fire, chatting and roasting marshmallows, when we heard something moving in the bushes. We both shrugged it off, thinking it was just an animal. But then we heard it again, louder this time, and it sounded like it was getting closer. We both got up and grabbed our flashlights, trying to get a better look. And that's when we saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the shadows. At first, we thought it was a man, but as we got closer, we realized it was something else entirely. The figure had antlers growing out of its head, and its eyes glowed a bright red. It was the stuff of nightmares. I froze, my heart racing, as my friend slowly backed away. I knew we had to get out of there, but I was too scared to move. As we stared at the figure, it let out a bone-chilling scream. We turned and ran, our hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't stop until we were back at our campsite, panting and sweating. We didn't sleep much that night, huddled together in our tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. In the morning, we packed up our gear and hiked out of there as fast as we could. We later learned that what we saw was a Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore that is said to be a cannibalistic spirit. I never thought I would believe in such things, but after that experience, I can't help but wonder what else might be out there in the wilderness. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I have to tell this story. I was hiking in the remote mountains of Montana last summer when I had a chilling encounter with a gigopler. It started out like any other hike, just me and my dog, enjoying the fresh air and beautiful scenery. We had been hiking for a few hours when I noticed something strange. It was a rustling sound, like something was moving through the bushes. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I saw it. Standing in a small clearing just a few feet away was a creature I had never seen before. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and had a thick, muscular body covered in matted fur. Its head was shaped like a giant pumpkin, with one enormous, bloodshot eye in the center. I froze, and so did my dog. We both stared at the creature, not moving a muscle. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, I started to back away, trying not to make any sudden movements. But the gigopler wasn't having it. It let out a bone-chilling roar and charged straight at me. My dog started barking and snapping at it, but it was no use. The gigopler was too strong, too fast. I don't know how I managed to escape, but somehow I did. I ran as fast as I could, my heart racing and my breath coming in short gasps. I could hear the gigopler crashing through the trees behind me, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed on the ground, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. I looked back at the trail, but there was no sign of the gigopler. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure, I never want to see a gigopler again. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I have to share my story. It's been haunting me since it happened, and I can't seem to shake the feeling that the gigopler is still out there, waiting for me. It was a typical camping trip with my friends. We had driven out to a remote area in the mountains, hoping to spend a few days away from civilization. We set up camp near a small lake and spent our days hiking and fishing. It was idyllic, until the night of the sighting. It was just after midnight when I heard something moving outside our tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a wolf. But the sound was too strange, too deliberate. It sounded like something walking on two legs. My heart raced as I reached for my flashlight. When I shone the light outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with matted fur and a single glowing eye. Its face was twisted into a grotesque snarl, revealing razor-sharp teeth. I froze, unable to move or speak. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity before turning and walking away, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, until I finally found the courage to wake up my friends. They thought I was joking at first, but the fear in my voice convinced them otherwise. We packed up our gear and left the campsite immediately, driving through the night until we reached civilization. Since then, I've done some research and discovered that what I saw was likely a Gigopler. They're known to inhabit remote areas and are often mistaken for skinwalkers or wendigos. They're dangerous creatures, and I count myself lucky to have survived the encounter. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go camping again. The memory of that night haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that the Gigopler is still out there, waiting for its next victim. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, and I'll always be grateful to be alive. I'm not someone who scares easily. But what I experienced last winter left me shaken to my core. I live in a remote area in the northern part of the United States. The winters here are harsh, and the snow piles up fast. I'm used to being alone, but this winter felt different. I had a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was a clear, cold night when I heard the howls for the first time. They were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. They echoed through the trees, and I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The next day, I found strange tracks in the snow around my cabin. They were too big to be from any animal I knew. I started to worry that I wasn't as alone as I thought. One evening, as I was stoking the fire, I caught a glimpse of movement outside my window. I dismissed it as my imagination, but then I saw it again. Something was out there, watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, hoping to scare off whatever was lurking in the darkness. But as soon as I stepped out into the snow, I knew I'd made a mistake. The howls started up again, louder and more urgent than before. That's when I saw it. A figure, taller than any man I'd ever seen, was walking towards me. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its body was emaciated and covered in matted fur. It was a Wendigo, a creature of legend that I'd heard stories about since I was a child. I froze, too terrified to move. The Wendigo approached me, and I could see the hunger in its eyes. I knew I was its prey. But then, something strange happened. The Wendigo stopped, as if it had sensed something. It looked towards the woods, and then it turned and vanished into the darkness. I don't know why it left me alone that night. But I do know that I'll never forget the terror I felt as I stared down a creature that I'd always believed was just a myth. And I'll never forget the relief I felt when it turned and disappeared into the night. I never believed in the supernatural, but that was before I encountered a skinwalker. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a friend's house. I had taken a wrong turn and found myself on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. The only thing I could see was the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the road ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, thinking it was someone in distress, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It had the body of a man, but its face was twisted into a grotesque mask, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. My heart pounding, I tried to swerve to avoid it, but it darted in front of my car, and I felt a sickening thud as I hit it. I slammed on the brakes, and as I got out of the car, I saw the figure rise from the ground, unscathed. I knew I had to get out of there, so I ran back to my car and drove as fast as I could. But the figure didn't give up. It chased me, keeping pace with my car, its eyes never leaving me. I was driving down the winding road, trying to shake it off, when I suddenly saw a flash of movement in the woods. My heart racing, I glanced over, and that's when I saw it. The Skinwalker, running alongside my car on all fours, its limbs contorted in ways no human could achieve. I was too terrified to think straight. All I could do was keep driving, hoping to outrun it. But it seemed to be gaining on me, its howls echoing through the night. Finally, I saw a small town up ahead, and I knew I had to make it there. I pushed the pedal to the floor, and my car surged forward, leaving the Skinwalker behind. When I finally arrived in town, I collapsed, trembling and drenched in sweat. I knew I had encountered something beyond my comprehension, something evil and supernatural. From that day on, I never drove down that road again. And even now, years later, I still hear its howls in my dreams, a chilling reminder of that night when I came face to face with a Skinwalker. I remember the day that I saw the Gigopler like it was yesterday. It was late autumn, and I was hiking alone in the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest. The trees were ablaze with orange and gold, and the air was crisp and cold. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed that the woods were getting quieter. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as it came closer, I realized that it was anything but. It stood on two legs, towering over me at well over 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in matted brown fur, and its head was like that of a wolf, but with one huge, glowing red eye staring back at me. I froze in terror, unsure of what to do. The Gigopler took a step closer, and I could hear its ragged breaths. I tried to back away slowly, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The creature let out a low growl, and I knew that I was in deep trouble. As it moved in for the kill, something inside of me snapped. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The sound of its footsteps echoed in my ears, and I knew that it was close behind me. Somehow, I made it back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the doors and started the engine, peeling out of the dirt lot and onto the highway. It's been months since that day, and I still have nightmares about the Gigopler. I know that it's out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go hiking again, but one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the day that I came face to face with the terrifying Gigopler.